Successfully deploying applications on SAP Business Technology Platform, BTP in short, is just the beginning. True value emerges when you can efficiently operate, maintain, and scale them. Efficiency is certainly very important for the ROI, but just as important is security. In this series, we explore actually how you can best achieve all that. And by the end of today's session, you will have a clear understanding of how to secure your entire environment with SAP BTP. A very warm welcome and thank you for joining our 12th and currently last episode of the series Mastering Day 2 Operations in SAP BTP. Secure configuration for your SAP BTP services. An overview of SAP security recommendations. I have the pleasure of having here with me three experts, Christian Kors, Jürgen Adolf, and Henrik Müller. Hendrik is Product Manager for SAP Cloud ALM Configuration and Security Analysis, and he survived the switch to the year 2000. In the past 10 years, he worked with many customers in various roles. Jürgen is Product Manager for Security at SAP SE in Walldorf, Germany. He is responsible for the roll-in and roll-out of product information referring to security in SAP products. Christian works as a Senior Product Manager at SAP. He has a background in computer science and held various positions at SAP during the last 25 years, starting as a developer and later moving into product management for SAP's security and governance products. He currently is responsible for several cloud services in SAP's security portfolio, covering secure authentication for SAP GUI, cryptographic capabilities, and digital certificates. And now, without further ado, over to you, Christian.
Yeah, thank you very much. Tanya, that was a nice introduction for all of us. It's a pleasure to be here with you and with all our participants. Today, it's about secure configuration for BTP services, and we have a really fully packed agenda. What we would like to talk about is, first of all, what are the BTP security recommendations? That will be a very, very brief and just pointing to the right resources. Then we'll have an extended session about SAP Cloud ALM, where you learn how monitoring recommendations can be configured and how to respond to them. And then we'll look in much more detail at recommendations for some high priority scenarios. So starting with the SAP Cloud Identity Services, and then if time permits, also looking into some smaller BTP services that are also highly relevant for security. And we also have a number of learning resources available that you can check later on, where you can do hands-on training on your own on working with security recommendations, and also do some further reading on the background. Let's look at the BTP security recommendations. It's basically content that we make available on the help portal. So if you go to the link that is there via the QR code, or if you have the slides, or if you click here, then you come to a page in the help portal that lists the security recommendations for BTP that we have collected from the different services in BTP and Cloud Identity Services included, and which gives you guidance on what SAP recommends, how you should configure your services, and also what kind of aspects of the service you should take a closer look at to make sure that they are running in a secure way. And hopefully this list will help you to find the right places where to check. In some cases, it's a high-level recommendation telling you what you should think about, what kind of decisions you need to make for yourself. But in other cases, it's also really possible to check for certain configuration switches and see if they are set in such a way that they map to the goals and the security requirements that you have for your landscape. The structure of the security recommendations is done in several dimensions. So you have the components here, which means the individual services. So you can for example, choose that you do the security recommendations one service at a time, check the recommendations for the service, and then continue with the next one. Of course, you can also decide to go via the priority, check the critical service or the critical recommendations for services first, and then go to the advanced and later to the recommended. If you have experience with the secure operations step, you can also take this as the starting point. If you already have people assigned to the different responsibility areas in the secure operations map, then you can also hand security recommendations to those people and let them cover the recommendations that are part of their specific topic on this map. As mentioned, we have different kinds of recommendations. Some are more general guidance, but there are also recommendations where we want to make a central reporting available so that you can look at a central page how the recommendations are fulfilled or not fulfilled in your landscape, and so that you can also show to your organization whether you are done with certain security configuration steps or whether there are still open topics that need to be handled. And we've decided to use our SAP Cloud ALM product for this functionality to report security recommendation status into Cloud ALM, and then give you all the functionality and capabilities of Cloud ALM to receive this information, to review it, and also to respond to it. And for an introduction about what's available in Cloud ALM and the details about how we bring in the security recommendations, handing over to Hendrik, and I'll keep the slides here rolling on my side.
Yeah, thank you. So the Cloud ALM, I'm sure many of you already use the Cloud ALM for operating your landscapes with health monitoring, with user monitoring, with business process monitoring, or use it for supporting implementations or services helping you with your cloud transformation. So this is not the goal here to discuss it, to indicate to you where the Cloud ALM is already helpful with regard to the security recommendations. The services typically make it part of their documentation that they refer to us, and vice versa. We have on our pages and the reference what cloud services we already support. So next slide. So what the configuration and security analysis actually is doing is very simple. We collect basically daily snapshots of configuration data from cloud services and on-premise systems also into a central configuration and change database. So there we maintain the current configurations and the history, and then we provide our functionality to work with the data. This is at the moment quite limited, so we can browse into the data, you can search in the data, you can analyze changes and get some status. So we are just in the beginning of really making it powerful means for your automated landscape operation. But we are on the way on it, and I will say a few words what is going to come. Of course, everything that you can do in the application, you can basically also do via API. So we have currently one analytics API supporting this needs. Regarding the setup and connectivity, there's actually not really much that you need to do for the cloud services. Basically, SAP is taking care of all the integration effort internally. And what you need to do then is just to switch on those services that you want to monitor on a regular basis, and then wait a little while until the first data push is there, and then consume the data. So this part is very simple, and if you want to look into it, there's the QR code for the demo tenant where you can have a review yourself. So next slide. So if I show you very quickly how this is organized. So if I browse into the data, then we organize the data basically by cloud service. So the identity authentication service would show up there with its name, and from there you could then browse into the data that it's providing. So in the middle of the screenshot, you would see there in blue different what we call configuration stores. So this is, let's say, containers that logical tables that contain then data that somehow has the same structure and the same semantic context. You would see on the right-hand side, since when the data is available, you would see on the left-hand side where this data actually belongs to. And in the case of the identity authentication services, it's quite mixed. So you have some data of the identity authentication tenant itself, like here the password policy. You have some data that relates to the apps for system administration, the administration console, the IaaS service, some data of the managed applications. So each of them would show up here as an asset, and also some stores that then relate to the identity providers on your side that are connected with this, right? So if I click into such a configuration store, then on the lower side of the slide here, you see how such data looks. So it's basically distributed into key and value fields, and in the most simple case, it's just the name and the value, like here for the password policy, the name that of the password policy that is assigned to this service. And what you see below this is enriched with a reference to a security recommendation from the help portal. So that's exactly that one with their index here, SecRec index we call it, and a status evaluated by the service that is pushing us the data, whether this current configuration is compliant to the configuration, to the recommendation, or non-compliant. So next slide. What is more useful, of course, in daily life is when you can search in the data. So we have on a text search, which you can apply basically all across your landscape or across a selected scope of services and systems, and you type in some kind of text string or some keyword or so what you would like to see. And then basically you get from each and every record that is matching to this search pattern, then the record from our CCDP. So if you want to check what password policies are there, then you would could type it in there, and you get a list here for this charged at Angelfish, for this administration console of the IaaS, for some other app, which is a new app, and you see on the right-hand side then the values that are there. And you see here already in this case, it's even a bit more than just pushing the data from the screen. Here you see the first entry says, well, this configuration is actually delegated to your corporate IDP. So whatever you figure out in detail will not be meaningful for this application in your landscape. The second example, you could also search for this compliant or non-compliant as a text field. So then you would get with the non-compliant a list of all the items that don't meet the requirements of this published security recommendation. You get a list that you could download then and process, or that you could process via some API. Next slide. Third example thing is, of course, to get to know about changes. So you see it here on the UI. It's not so good in the sense that you would need to drill down date by date, service by service, and store by store. So to make it a bit easier to work with these change lists, then you can download them into an Excel and have a flat list which tells you for which service, which data store, which configuration has been changed on what date and is now valid since the date in the very right column. So this is, at least on a manual level, something that gives you insight into data and to check with it how you can apply it and prepare yourself for the time when there's more automation available. Next slide. And this is actually where we are working very hard with our team to get to a level of feature that is very similar to the solution manager and the basic needs that are covered there. And already for this year, we want to give you the feature of selecting validation rules other than those that are in the hard-coded basically from in the data set, create alerts or notifications, and we are also looking into a change of our home screen, which is kind of little security dashboard, if you like. And to do this right, we are working very closely in a customer engagement initiative, so discussing needs, priorities, and also details of how we are going to do this. Next slide. Yeah, so just to give you a glimpse into a preview. So like on our home screen, we today have, you see it here on the left, for an identity authentication service. Basically, the information, how many data stores are collected, whether the data collection and integration is running smoothly. And yeah, as a next step, we would then change it and give it a more meaningful way in the sense of validating critical and prior to metrics, so results of how secure the configurations are, and the overall compliance status with regard to some rule set, which is then taking at least some part of their security recommendations, the most critical ones, obviously. Yeah, with this, I think the general introduction how the ILM will support you is given, and I think then we can go take a look into the actual recommendations and how precisely they are reflected in the data.
Yeah, exactly. Thanks, Henrik. Yeah, that's what we are trying to do now. So we'll talk about scenarios in the context of cloud identity services. I'll explain a bit some of the recommendations that we've documented, and then Henrik can show us how these are now displayed on the cloud ALM side, and how you can identify whether you're compliant or not in a nice UI. Cloud identity services consists of a number of services, and the most prominent one is certainly identity authentication, which is our strategic solution for authentication in the cloud. It's an identity provider supporting both SAML and the now more and more popular OpenID Connect. It comes with pre-configured trust to many SAP cloud applications, meaning if you get an SAP cloud application, then you will always also either get an identity authentication service tenant, or it will be automatically connected to an identity authentication service tenant that you already have. And with that, you can then start working with the application without having to do a major security project to configure the single sign-on aspect of the landscape. While identity authentication service has many capabilities in the area of secure authentication, many customers already have some third-party identity provider, and that's why we also support the proxying. So you can also use a third-party identity provider integrated with identity authentication service, which then acts as a proxy. And then all the authentication done for SAP applications goes via identity authentication service to your existing identity provider. So the SAP landscape is integrated with identity authentication service, but the actual end user authentication is then done with the identity provider that you may have been using before. Of course, as identity authentication service, as the name indicates, takes care of authentication. It's very important to ensure this is done in a secure manner, and there are a number of recommendations in this area that we have. Of course, you should enable multi-factor authentication for administrators of identity authentication service, because they have a lot of influence on what the authentication looks like. Which users can authenticate, what kind of authentication factors are enabled for end users, and so on. That's why it makes a lot of sense to protect the administration console. We also recommend that you switch to passwordless authentication wherever possible, because passwords are notoriously insecure. They can be phished, they can be somehow lost in other ways, and that's why something like a digital certificate or a FIDO-based factor is much more secure, because that's not something that can be for example, copied via a keylogger. Identity Authentication Service also has support for very specific scenarios that open up the scenario a bit, something like self-registrations, which might be valuable in a web shop if consumers are allowed to create their own accounts in the Identity Authentication Service tenant. Of course, you have to think about whether this makes sense for your environment. If you want people to be able to create their own accounts in your identity provider, or if you want to ensure that accounts are only created when triggered by a central identity management solution. And in that case, you should, of course, then disable self-registration. Another thing that we support more for the consumer-facing scenarios is social sign-in. So if you want to authenticate with, I don't know, Facebook or something like that, that is also possible. But again, the question if it makes sense for an enterprise scenario, or if you really have those consumer-facing use cases where such an open access would really be reasonable. And if you do not have these consumer scenarios, then you should, of course, also disable social sign-in. If you integrate with existing corporate identity providers, that's perfectly fine. But of course, you then also should keep an eye on what kind of integrations you have, that you do not have some rogue identity providers connected that maybe you don't have under your control, and that because they're integrated with Identity Authentication Service would suddenly then be accepted as authenticating systems for your landscape. That's why a recommendation is also to check on a regular basis what kind of third-party identity providers are possibly integrated with Identity Authentication Service. Maybe that was done for testing purposes, something like that. But then you need to make sure that you clean up afterwards, that you're not opening up your authentication landscape in ways that you don't really want.
Yeah,
How does it look like on the CALM side?
Right. So here you see basically a similar screen as before, which highlighted the data that corresponds to these recommendations. In red at the bottom, you see some record for social sign-in and a second one for the user application access with the corresponding security recommendation ID as a reference. And if you would look at the IIS user interface, then you would see this is basically like a parameter configuration. So it's very similar here, right? And you could simply take here the compliant or non-compliant rating as the truth for your validation as indicated before. For the multi-factor authentication, it's a bit more complicated, obviously. You see here a record that is from the system app, so from the admin console of the IIS itself, where you definitely want to have some additional protection with a second factor. And since this is not a single configuration in the IIS, we made this appear like a single configuration by giving it this artificial configuration name, and then simply raise when it's misconfigured, or whether it's not configured at all, or whether it's configured. Okay, the details we currently only have in the help portal. How this may come closer together is a topic for the future. In yellow, you see some other recommendations, like here for the password policies, or the SAP delivers 2 standard password policies. One is a bit stronger, named enterprise. So this is the recommended one. Standard is a bit weak. And you could then make it compliant if you either select this enterprise password policy, or if you create your own password policy where you then state this is how we expect it in our company. Last but not least, disabling password authentication at all. Again, this is multiple configurations in the IIS, which is then evaluated on the service side and given a rating. You see there are also 2 items highlighted in blue. So, and you also see that there is actually no recommendation from the help portal assigned to this. But it's, I think, also important maybe from your side. So which identity provider would be then the one that is taken by default when it's accessing a certain application? SAP cannot judge what is right for your company, so therefore we don't have a dedicated recommendation and index. But later on, when our application allows you to build your own validation rules, then you may have some preference what you would like to see there. And maybe it's not the SAP ID services, but some service type service on your side. Next slide. Right, so for the password policy, especially when you define your own one, corporate one, then you may want to validate whether it's exactly the way that you want to see it, or whether it just has the right name. So we collect the different parameters and you could validate them separately. Once centrally, and then you could see that check whether the correct password policy is assigned. Again, I just wanted to highlight to the upper part of the screen, right? So if the password policy is not relevant, then we will show this. And I think this is a big advantage to the on-premise world or history, where you then had to figure out and build your conditions and dependencies yourself, and to make sure you measure only those configurations that are relevant. Next slide, and back to you, Christian.
Thanks, Henrik. We were just talking about connecting corporate identity providers, and usually this is already being done by customers for business applications. But it's also possible now to replace or to bring in your own identity provider when it comes to the platform identity provider. And platform means that you are using this identity provider for the people that access the BTP cockpit, meaning developers or administrators. So not the business users, but rather the people that work on the very technical side. There is also possible now to use the identity authentication service as the identity provider, in addition to the default identity provider. So this SAP ID service that Henrik was just mentioning. And it's also, of course, a recommendation to support your own, or to bring in your own identity provider, because there you have then the chance to, for example, enforce the kind of multi-factor authentication that you are also using for your business users. And maybe you have other specific requirements for your organization that you want to see supported here.
Yeah, this slide puts together then basically the information that for each and every application is provided regarding the default IDP that is used, right? So it has an internal ID that might be good for troubleshooting, but you won't see it on any UI. You have a display name, which would correspond to the real world. You will see it. You have some technical name that relates to where this, to the integration, and the IDP type as shown already before. So this you may use for validating then on your side. And if you go on the next slide, then of course you could may want to check regularly also if there's any new or unexpected corporate identity provider. This you can do in different ways on our side. So you could so we have you could check the configurations of the no, let's start on the right hand side. So we have one data store which essentially tells what is part of our landscape. So if there's a new record, a new IDP, corporate IDP added, then you would see it there, and this would be very first way to recognize it, right? On the left hand side, then you would see most of the configurations that we collect from this identity provider, so the information that the identity service knows about it, and you could then also validate there if it is an identity provider that meets your security requirements. Again, this is something SAP doesn't judge, so all the data is unrated, but it's still like a parameter like values. So back to you, Christian.
Yeah, perhaps one more.
One more. Oh, sorry. Okay. Okay. Yeah, you're going to tell about authorizations actually. So I think there's mixed. Maybe you can go first to your slide and then.
Yeah, mine is about the new version for authorizations. That's why I.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. So okay. Yeah. So since quite some time, the identity service have an authorization concept which has like 6 or 7 roles actually, right? And some of them are really powerful, and you have to be very careful, right? So if you have the role for managed tenant configuration, then you can create your own users. You can even assign additional roles. And you manage the corporate IDP is obviously very powerful, and also managing the users directly from the IIS. So we recommend to somehow keep this under control. Now, we don't want to give you the names of the people who are having this authorization, but we want to give you at least a count. So a count of the human users and a count of the systems, which is then referring to technical users, integrations. And then you can, based on this, review whether this really corresponds to the requirements that the users in the integration, for example, have exactly the privileges that they need. So here we have a recommendation that we have published. We have here the data to validate it, and you see we haven't made the reference to the recommendation, and the reason is basically we didn't want to cause confusion. What number of assignments is good or not good or acceptable in your case? There's so many opinions, and we can hardly say this across all the companies using it. So therefore, a status would be difficult. Now, if you assign it the index and don't give a rating, then it's also a bit weird. Then we'll get questioned probably what's going on here. We have actually the case where we say we provide unrated, but this is reserved for things where we cannot know due to configuration, like there with the password policy. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so this is what we do, and what when now Christian explains what better ways of providing authorizations you have, then you can use this, of course, also to make sure that the number of assignments with these roles is going down over time and stays small.
Exactly, yeah. Yeah, exactly. And that's why I moved this slide here now behind the other. So there is a new way to handle authorizations. What Henrik just explained to you was the way that probably most of you know, where you have administrator users in the console of identity authentication service, and then you have flags that you can set for those users to give a certain kind of authorizations. We have recently released a new policy-based approach to authorizations. This means that you can now assign authorizations to administrators based on policies that you can define, policies that give a much more fine-grained access to the capabilities of cloud identity services. So either based on data that only a subset of, for example, the users is visible to an administrator, or only certain attributes of a user record can be modified by an administrator, and so on. And another advantage of this approach is that these kind of authorizations are based on the group management of the underlying identity directory, which is also being used for landscape-wide business application authorizations. And that means that you can manage the assignment and the removal of these kinds of authorizations via a standard identity management solution, and use the SCIM API to manage those. That means that you disable then these authorizations that Hendrik mentioned, the old style flags that you have in the UI, and instead assign authorizations as standard roles, like for business applications via the skin API of the SAP Cloud Identity Services. Or you do it in the UI for the groups management in Cloud Identity Services, but then it's a standardized way that brings together administrative authorizations and business user authorizations into the same process. It's an optional feature. You have to enable it to see those policies. But once they're enabled, you can then remove the old style authorization flags from the administrators. There are also recommendations that go maybe a bit beyond the scope of the security recommendations. We have this in our reference architectures that you find on the Discovery Center. Here, for example, is a reference architecture, how the identity lifecycle should be set up for SAP cloud applications. So with Cloud Identity Services in the middle, where you have the identity directory for the persistence of users and roles and assignments, you have the identity provisioning for forwarding those information, so user accounts and assignments to business applications. And you have potentially a third-party identity provider that receives employee or contingent worker data from SuccessFactors, from field glass, and then handles the creation of users and provisions these into the identity directory. So there's a lot more to be learned here. That's why we've put a link down there if you want to look into this. And there are also many more reference architectures that might be relevant for you. That's why I highly encourage that you take a look at this. Again, it's not a simple on-off switch that we would be reporting in Cloud ALM, but rather a recommendation that then guides the architecture of your whole landscape.
So when you take care about security of your identity services in the BTP environment, then of course you will also extend this to the other cloud solutions. And if the SuccessFactors is, for example, at the beginning of your chain of providing the identities, then of course the recommendations from there should also be measured, right? So the recommendations are published already. So in the Trust Center, you would find this for basically all the products. And the SuccessFactors, we are already also working on integrating their data into our Cloud ALM. Same for the S/4HANA Public Cloud. Customer experience, we had some where we are already working on, and of course also the various services from the BTP side that are also relevant, like integration suite, maybe one that you're waiting. So over time, the journey goes on. So it goes beyond what we have shown you, and it follows the same principles, right? So, and as soon as we have additional data, we have additional features, and I think we are good in position to really support then security needs on a larger scale. So next, I'll hand over to you. Okay.
Yeah, so moving away now from identity authentication and the very high level view on the overall landscape, identity provisioning service is another part of Cloud Identity Services. This is the service that provisions user accounts and group or role assignments into the business applications to give access. And also here, a number of recommendations are in place because to be able to access business applications and create user accounts in there, identity provisioning service also needs to authenticate to those business applications. And of course, this authentication also needs to be secure so that you don't open up a channel there that could be abused by somebody else, somebody impersonating the provisioning service and then modifying data in your system. Again, we recommend a certificate-based authentication if possible, simply because that way you do not need to work with passwords. If you do certificate authentication, you always need to think about certificate renewal, which should be automated whenever possible. I have some more details regarding that on the next slide. there are some settings that you can use for testing environments, but you should never use in production. Like there's this trust all switch, which basically disables the server-side authentication. So you do not then check whether you're connecting to the right business application system. Could be then also a different target system. That of course should not be done in a production environment. You should have secure protocols all along the way. So HTTPS, of course. In some cases where you might still have to store credentials locally, like passwords or OAuth secrets, you should use the credential properties that we provide in Identity Provisioning Service, because these then do not show the secure values in the UI in plain text, but rather in a masked way, so that they cannot be stolen. And another thing, when we make the Identity Provisioning Service available to you, there is only one user that is enabled as administrator. And of course, there it also makes sense to give this role to at least one more person, so that you don't run into situations where there's nobody available who would have the administrative right to manage the Identity Provisioning Service. I mentioned automatic certificate renewal, and that is possible on Identity Provisioning Service. Again, it's important for you because if a certificate expires, it means that it's no longer trusted on the receiving side. So Identity Provisioning Service would no longer be able to manage users and access in a business application if the certificate used for authenticating to the business application is no longer valid. That's why it's always makes sense to go for automatic renewal, that the certificate used to access the target system is always kept up to date. However, there is a case where this might not work, and that's if a certificate is being pinned on the target system side. That means that the target system not only checks the validity of the signatures and the validity of the from to dates on the certificate, but rather also checks the identity or the bitwise identity of, for example, the public key or the hash value of the whole certificate, because that means that if you renew the certificate and then you automatically renew the key pair, it will no longer be accepted on the target system side. We're trying to get rid of those scenarios, but if you still run into one of those, you have to work with a different approach. Then automatic generation or regeneration of certificates is not possible in that kind of scenario. But again, we're trying to really eliminate those so that wherever possible, you can enable the automatic renewal of certificates when working with the Identity Provisioning Service.
So for the very short-lived certificates, we would probably only have the information whether the automatic renewal by means of SAP is enabled, yes or no. For the other cases, the certificates we need to onboard, we have them actually for the custom domain service already, and for the other services, it's part of the roadmap. And of course, settings like trust all or secure protocols you would again find in our recommendations and in our data. So, Jürgen, I think it's on yours.
Yeah, thank you, Christian and Hendrik. Really very detailed description of what we have and the main part, but we also have other recommendations for other important scenarios on BTP. Next slide, Christian. For example, the audit log service. I rush a little bit so that we can answer the questions. I guess you all know what the audit log service is doing, so skip this slide to the next one. Mm-hmm. So what we have, what you should take care of when you're using the audit log service is to make the most out of the audit log service, regularly download and archive the logs, ideally into a central audit system, and automate this using the audit log retrieval API, and also keep an eye on retention settings to ensure they meet your compliance requirements, in short. So that's also recommendations you can find in the recommendations. So now to the connectivity service, Christian, next slide. I will focus on the recommendations. So when you use the destination service as part of the connectivity services, ensure that all destinations use TLS 1.2 or higher, and enable the automatic renewal of the sub-generated certificates. And for internet connections, use OAuth or SAML. And for on-premise, use principal propagation. Then avoid deprecated methods like sub-assertion SSO. And mutual TLS is recommended for your productive systems. And always validate server certificates and avoid trusting all the certificates, especially in productive environments. Next slide. For the cloud connector, enforce the HTTPS for all productive environments and manage the exceptions carefully, and avoid using broad subpaths in URLs to reduce the exposure, and use LDAP-S for encrypted LDAP communication and SNC for secure backend access. And then also limit the number of trusted root CAs and only enable necessary cipher suites. Also replace the default superadmin with the LDAP-based user to ensure the traceability and the segregation of duties, and enable audit logging and only activate the traces in the Cloud Connector when needed. Ensure they are disabled afterwards when you don't need it anymore. And next slide, we come to the custom domain service, which is also sending the data to the Cloud ILM. When managing custom domains, assign the admin roles only to those who need them and stick to the default TLS settings unless a specific use case requires changes. Monitor the certificate expiration warnings in the custom domain manager and renew the certificates proactively, and only trust the CA certificates you actually need. Don't overload the trust store. Then next, let's dive deeper into the learning possibilities we have. If you like to explore more of the security recommendations in action, we have got this hands-on session ready for you. You can try it out anytime using the BTP trial account and trial IIS tenant. It's a great way to deepen your understanding and get practical experience at your own pace under this link, or you can do it afterwards. And next page is we also advise you to have a look at the CIO guide to see our approach to identity and access management, like Christian explained it. And here is everything explained, what you want to know, to have a comprehensive overview about all the IAM scenarios, IAM solutions we provide, reference architectures, and so on. And now next is the next two slides. You can have a look later on, this one and the next, where we have a lot of links with learning material where you get some more infos. And with that, I would open now for the questions and answers.
Great. Thank you so much to all of you for this great presentation. We really have quite a few questions. So I would like to ask you to answer the questions as short as possible and as detailed as necessary. Let me start with the first one. Comment. As far as I am aware, you cannot configure any event or alert in SAP Cloud ALM for configuration and security analysis.
Exactly, that's going to come. So we are working hard on it, and I just have to ask you to be a bit more patient.
Great, thank you. Some recommendations would be superfluous if SAP followed a secure by design and by default approach. For example, like MFA for sysadmin access. Will we see progress here?
Yes, of course, we are always working in that direction, the secure by design, by default. Sometimes it's for historical reasons or to keep compatibility that we cannot enforce this because it might break existing scenarios. But of course, it is our goal to enable this wherever it can be done without being disruptive.
Great, thank you. In case of vendors accessing SAP BTP applications, is social single sign-on their recommended solution? And then there's an add-on. Maybe I can quickly add that one. So it was referring to, he wanted to know if for B2C or B2P small scenarios, maybe social SSO is possible, or the recommendation is customer identity and access management.
I think there you should, wherever possible, go into customer identity and access management. So we have some capabilities in cloud identity services for B2C, so for consumer scenarios or B2B scenarios. But we also have more advanced solutions for this, even in the SAP portfolio. So SAP's Customer Data Cloud, for example, is a much more complete solution when it comes to CIAM. And I think if you are going into these consumer scenarios, then you should really check what they offer and the recommendations that come from their side.
Thank you. Platform has a huge disadvantage. You need to use a separate link, which will use the SSO functionality. For sub-accounts, it is better solved. Customer expectation is to set custom IDP as default. Any comment on that?
Yeah, that's currently not possible. So you, like the participant said, you always have to go via a dedicated URL that people need to be aware of. Yeah, I mean, it affects the platform users. So the administrators and developers, it doesn't affect the business users. But yeah, I've been also struggling with that. So we'll have to think if we find a way to get around this. But currently, I'm not aware of any solution.
Thank you. Do we have a report showing which user is assigned to the specific role and role collection?
I don't think we have that out of the box, but it could be done by accessing the identity directory and reading this information from the identity directory. And I mean, SAP's recommendation in general is to have a third-party identity management solution sitting on top of the identity directory, for example, Microsoft Entra ID. And I'm sure that there you will have all the analysis and reporting tools to also do this kind of investigation on top of the SAP data.
Thank you. What API do you use to gather details about users, whether they are admin business or similar, or maybe checking specific groups?
We have a SCIM API in the identity directory, which exposes user records and also groups and the assignments between the two. Whether this now gives all the information for administrators, I would have to check, but I assume it should be sufficient because, again, it's just then persons with administrative roles, and that information should be available also via the standard SCIM APIs.
Thank you. Which kind of certificates can IPS automatically renew in on-prem systems?
Okay, now that's a misunderstanding. The certificates that I was talking about are the certificates that IPS uses for provisioning into target applications. So it's not like certificate lifecycle management on-premise systems. It's only if you have a business application that allows IPS to access it via, for example, a SCIM API, and then do authentication with a certificate. If you use IPS for on-premise systems, and I'm not sure that's very common, then I don't think there's an automatic way to renew the certificate on the on-premise side. But again, for on-premise systems, people usually use on-premise identity management and not so much the identity provisioning service.
Okay. Do you have a log service to see which user has which role and role group and role collection?
Yeah, I think that we just had that. So in the end, the data is in the identity directory. We have, I mean, you can search in the UI, you can go via an API, or you have an identity management solution that works on top of our data and then provides reporting.
Thank you. Can you comment on the use of UUID and the long-term plan from SAP to use it for all solutions and print prop like today for Tax Center Joule? Any guidelines on how to migrate to this new approach?
I guess for guidelines, we don't have the time now, but yes, so I mean, I guess it's about the global user ID, and yes, this is very much relevant now because it's required for many of our latest innovations. Something like Joule, where you need to bring together all the systems that a person has access to provide really all the data to the AI that might be relevant. There, you need to move to the global user ID. You need to integrate your identity authentication service, your cloud identity services. And so yes, we are working with many customers to bring them on top of cloud identity services with a scope that is required for Joule, and that includes also the global user ID. But again, I'm sure there's content out there with recommendations how to do it, and I'm sure our consulting has some great ideas, but it's probably more a day workshop than a 5-minute session here.
Thank you. How are you extracting user details from Cloud Foundry? There are as well higher role like manager and so on. Is there an API for this? If not, then when will there be an API for this?
There I must say, I don't know. Jürgen, do you know by chance?
I guess also for the user management in the Cloud Foundry part, we have APIs from Cloud Foundry, so you can use the Cloud Foundry APIs, as far as I know.
Okay.
Thank you. The next question, enabling principal propagation for RFC, CNC is a nightmare, and the support for this is not helpful. Can you please work to improve the documentation so this can be accomplished as you recommend?
Yes, if we have the details, maybe if there's something concrete, then you can forward it to us. We have the emails in the slide deck, and then we can take a look what's wrong and get it fixed.
That would be great. Thank you very much. What time do we have?
3 minutes.
So Entra and SailPoint is asking us to provide the API to the IAS to get rid of the identity directory. I have been searching which SCIM and API could provide this report.
I'm not sure I understand the question.
Yeah.
Anyway, with Entra, there is already a very close collaboration going on, and there are already some blogs out there how Entra ID can connect with the identity directory, what the recommendations are, technical capabilities. There's also a lot in work right now. So I think some content should be available. Again, if it's not, then maybe also something to handle offline. We have some contacts at Microsoft that we can ask if anything is missing on the documentation side, either on our side or on their side, and then we can make that available.
I actually don't see any further question. There's another clarifications with regards to Cloud Foundry for users in CF. Unfortunately, there is no API for Cloud Foundry. There is only BTP CLI. Not sure whether that helps you. So
I think we also have to take that offline. So I don't have an answer right now.
Yeah, all the questions you have, and if you have some questions some minutes later, you can see the email address from Christian and myself in the slide deck, which we will provide it be provided to you, and then just send us the emails, and we will take care and check with the experts we need. And if we don't, if we can't answer it ourselves.
Perfect. I think that is an absolutely great offer from you. And we're actually 1 minute on top of the hour. Another possibility is if any questions pop up, please put them in the comments area underneath this video, and we will also answer your questions there. And with this, again, big thank you for our experts for your excellent presentation and answering all the questions. And big thank you to all attendees for joining. We hope you got a lot of value from this session. And I wish you a great day, great evening, depending on where you are.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Tanya.
Thank you very much.
Great presentation. Thank you.